I am a journalist. I currently executive produce and host a show on CNN called This Is Life. And I've been working as a journalist for over 25 years, which is quite a long time. I started working as a reporter when I was 18 for a show that was seen in schools across the country. And then I went on to get a job hosting or co-hosting The View on ABC. And from there, I went on to host a show on the National Geographic Channel. And then I started working for a woman you might have heard of named Oprah Winfrey. And then I hosted a show on Oprah's channel OWN called Our America. And then afterwards, I started hosting This Is Life on CNN, and that's what I'm doing now.
When you were younger, what did you want to be when you grew up?
When I was young, I really wanted to pursue television because I grew up in a family that didn't have a lot of money, and I grew up in a community that was not diverse at all. In fact, there were probably 5 Asian kids in my entire high school of 2,500 kids, and 2 of them had the same last name, mine. I thought that if I could get on TV, maybe I could have a better life one day. But I never saw anyone who looked anything like me other than Connie Chung. And you all are probably too young to remember that, or to know that Connie Chung was the first Asian American woman on the national scene. And she was just this incredibly graceful and intelligent Asian woman who delivered the news every night. And so I thought if I could have a career like Connie Chung's, maybe I can have a better life one day. And I ended up getting a job pretty early on when I was 18 years old. I was a reporter for a show called Channel One News, which was seen in schools across the country. And that show sent me all over the world to cover the stories. And many of the things that I saw in the field really changed my life. And my desire went from just wanting to be on TV to wanting to tell stories, to wanting to communicate what I was seeing to a bigger audience.
Can you tell us about what it was like being 18 and doing what you were doing at that time?
For me, I never got a chance to travel and see the world that much when I was a kid. And so when I started working for Channel One News when I was 18 years old, and I did that for 7 or 8 years, it was an opportunity to see the world many times over. And I have to say that the opportunity to travel was the best education I could have ever conceived of. Um, I, I I became a smarter person. I became a better person. I became a more well versed person as a result of travel. And if I can impart sorry, and if I can impart any advice onto young people, I would say if you have a chance to leave your comfort zone and travel, I strongly suggest you do so. Even though I traveled to so many different countries in my late teens and early 20s, my biggest regret was not living in another country for about a year and immersing myself in another culture and in another language.
Were your parents supportive of a career in television?
I can't say my parents were exactly supportive of my career because they really wanted me to go into something more traditional. But when they started to see that I was making a pretty decent salary at a fairly young age, they started to become more okay with it. Um, they have since become incredible supporters of mine. They didn't love when I was traveling to conflict zones when I was at Channel One. You know, I covered the civil war in Afghanistan when I was 21 years old. I covered drug wars in South America in my early 20s. So I did some things that now when I think back on, I am sort of in disbelief that I did. And I sometimes did so without even telling my parents because I was on my own working. And as a mother now, I desperately hope that my kids are more communicative with me when they decide to travel. Although I'm definitely a proponent of young people starting to travel early and getting familiar with the world.
So many of your assignments are extremely dangerous, but which one do you think was the most dangerous?
The most dangerous assignment for me was kind of an unexpected one. I was covering a story in Colombia in South America, and I had secured an interview with Colombia's then president, Uribe. And he told us to meet him in this town that he had recently liberated from the guerrilla rebels. And so he was going to land his helicopter in the square and give a speech to the audience, and then we were to meet him at an undisclosed location. And as his helicopter was hovering, the guerrilla soldiers started firing onto the crowd, and I was in that crowd. And we all scattered and were hiding behind, you know, concrete blocks and cars and things like that. And it was a really terrifying experience. Fortunately, none of my team were injured in any way. I don't believe that anyone was injured that day. I thought that we had lost the interview with the president, but a couple of hours after the incident, the president called us to say that the interview was still on, and so it turned out to be a pretty spectacular experience, despite how terrifying it was.
Were there any unique challenges growing up as the daughter of a Chinese and Taiwanese immigrant in California during the 1980s and 70s?
I was definitely teased a lot when I was in middle school and high school because there weren't a lot of Asians in my school. I don't think it was malicious, and people weren't exactly mean to me, but I was just teased a lot. I think that the kids in my school just thought, oh, she thinks it's funny. But in fact, I can't tell you the number of times I went home crying because when you are in middle school and high school, you're so concerned about fitting in and people liking you. And the fact that I stood out and I was different and people were constantly reminding me that I was different, that was really hard for me. But at the same time, I think that that adversity propelled me to want to achieve more. I think going through the struggles that I did really made me want to work harder to overcome a lot of those things. And so now, as an Asian American woman, I couldn't be prouder of my background. There are so many exciting things that are happening right now in the world, particularly in the Asia region. And I think it's been a real asset to me to be Asian American, And it's interesting because I never would have thought I would say this when I was growing up because as a young person, I really hated being Chinese American. My house always smelled like Chinese food. I didn't like to invite people over. But now, um, being Asian is definitely an asset, and I'm just so proud of being Asian American.
In high school, what clubs, activities, or sports did you participate in?
I was a very involved high school kid. I was in speech and debate. I was in newspaper. I swam for a little while and I played tennis, but I started working for a show called Scratch when I was 16, and that was my sophomore year. Scratch was a nationally syndicated teen magazine show, and that was even before I started working for Channel One. And after I started working for Scratch, I started to do less school activities because I was so busy with my job with Scratch. But because Scratch was produced by a local news affiliate, I used the opportunity to get an internship in the newsroom. So before classes in the morning, I would go and I would run the teleprompters for the morning newscast. And then after school would end, I would drive back to the news station and I would sit with the writers. And that's where I really learned how the news business worked. So while I was involved with a lot of school activities in high school until sophomore year. After sophomore year, I was really focused on learning how the news business worked.
Besides people unfortunately teasing you, did you experience any put downs in high school?
Other than being teased for being Asian, I really didn't experience being put down. And I was I think I was a fairly popular kid. I had a lot of friends. I had friends from different kind of social groups. Like I was friends with the jocks and the skaters and the cheerleaders and the goths. um, but definitely I got teased a lot for being Asian, and that was hard. But again, it's really that experience I think made me a lot stronger, and that's what I would say to young people who have experienced bullying or teasing. That it seems like it's so present and so devastating while you're experiencing it, but that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? And so after high school ends, you, I think, will be more empowered, and be stronger and better able to overcome a lot of obstacles that you experienced during high school.
What obstacles did you face while pursuing your career as a journalist?
I didn't really face too many obstacles in the beginning of my career when I was younger. I think that, I shouldn't say I think, sadly, the journalism field and the television business, they're a young person's business. And so as a young person, I really excelled and I was able to accomplish a lot. As I get older, I have to say that I have some concerns because I work in a young person's business. And I never felt inhibited by my ethnicity or my gender in the beginning of my career. And I have been able to achieve a fair degree of success as a journalist. I mean, I know a lot of journalists who would really love to be able to do long form documentaries like I do. But I do have to say that there is a very palpable disparity between um, what men receive in this business and what women receive in this business, and the promotion that men receive versus the promotion women receive. And unfortunately, the news business, the world of journalism, still is a very male dominated one. And it wasn't until fairly recently that even I started to feel like I needed to stand up for myself more and to speak up for myself more. And that's something that I think women need to always remember. They need to always recognize what they're worth and be willing to stand up for what they're worth. I've been in a couple of different situations where my male counterparts, they produced a similar kind of show, they received similar ratings, but somehow they were receiving more compensation and they were getting picked up, which means they were getting their seasons extended, and I wasn't. And a couple of times I've had to say, um, I need to stand up for myself, and I need to communicate to executives that they can't, they shouldn't overlook me. I wish I didn't have to play that gender card, but sadly, this industry is still quite male dominated.
Was there someone specific that helped you or believed in you along the way?
There were so many people who helped me and believed in me along the way. I was really lucky that I got a chance to work with the likes of Barbara Walters and Meredith Vieira and Joy Behar and even Oprah. And all of those women, I think, looked out for me and gave me opportunities that I might otherwise not have. But see, there I go again. See, kind of. I think women tend to underestimate themselves. I have always worked really hard. I've always been incredibly passionate about what I do, and I appreciate that these formidable women recognized my work and gave me opportunities. And I think that if you do work really hard and give it your all, and you become a really good storyteller and are a sponge that likes to absorb things, you will find that there will be people along the way who will look out for you and give you opportunities. But sometimes you just have to ask, you know? I was someone who was never afraid of asking, can I just hang out with you? Could I spend the day with you? Could I buy you lunch? And I got a lot of no's, but I also got a few yeses. And those yeses turned out to be pretty impactful. The late Richard Holbrooke, who was the UN ambassador from the United States, was someone whose career I'd always admired. And one day I just approached him and asked him if I could take him out for lunch. And he agreed. And we became fast friends. And um, he opened the door in many ways for me to know so much about things that were going on in the world. I mean, I learned a lot about diplomacy from him, and the reason is because I asked.
Was there anyone who made it harder than it should have been?
I can't say that there were a lot of people who made things harder for me. I think in general for women, it's just harder. And women, as a result, have to work harder. And most importantly, women just can't lose sight of how much they are worth. It's so important to be confident in who you are and what you do and be willing to stand up for yourself, because I'll tell you something, that guy who has achieved exactly what you've achieved, who is as smart as you are, who is as accomplished as you are, probably doesn't have a problem demanding what he feels he's worth. And my hope is that women feel compelled to do so as well. I learned this lesson fairly late in life, but I have certainly recognized that it makes a difference when you are able to stand up for yourself, and you do.
What was your first big break?
My first big break was definitely becoming the host of a nationally syndicated teen magazine show called Scratch. There was a big audition in a local mall, and I would say about 500 high school kids showed up, and miraculously, I was chosen as one of the four hosts of the show. And that was my first entree into the TV business. It was my first job on TV, but also it was the first opportunity that I had to start working in a newsroom because that show was produced by a local news affiliate.
What accelerated you to the next level once you got your big break?
I always try to be aware of what the next opportunity could be. So even now, as I executive produce and host a show on CNN, I'm always looking for, okay, what other opportunities are there? And so my first big break came when I was 16, when I was hosting this show, but I used that to get an internship in the newsroom. And then after I did that, I would spend the summers in Los Angeles with my mom or some relatives, and I would call every TV outlet in the phone book. We used phone books back then. And I would beg them to let me hang out or let me intern or just spend some time getting coffee for people or filing papers or I every summer wanted to just work. I wanted to just learn how things worked. And I've interned everywhere from an organization called Women in Film to a game show called Joker's Wild, to a couple local news outlets. So for me, growing up without a lot of money or opportunities, I really recognized that I needed to create those opportunities for myself.
Are there any quote unquote glass ceilings that you broke during your very successful career as an investigative journalist?
I'm not sure if I broke any glass ceilings, but it is kind of interesting that I'm the only woman with a primetime television show on CNN, a primetime series, I should say. There are other women who have shows, but when you look at CNN's original series programming, I'm the only woman who has a show. And while I'm thrilled and I'm grateful that I have this opportunity to have this show, I really hope that the network recognizes the importance of having more diverse women in their primetime lineup.
What would you tell your 16-year-old self if she was standing right in front of you now?
I would tell my 16-year-old self to always stand up for yourself, to not worry about a lot of the trivial things that concern you in high school, because high school as much fun and as much of a great experience as it is, you're going to one day close the book on it. So all of those things that stress you out, all of those people who may not be nice to you, at a certain point, you're literally going to walk away from that part of your life and you're going to open a new book. And I know that my 16-year-old self was very concerned about a lot of the things that happened in high school. And what I would say to myself is that it's not going to matter one day, and that that you should gather up your really good friends, the girls and the guys who have your back, and not worry about all the petty stuff that a lot of people get concerned about in high school.
For all the kids who struggle with ADD, what are the positives and negatives of having ADD and being a journalist?
Whew, that's a good question. Having ADD has definitely been a struggle for me, especially when I was in school. When I was in high school, I really had a hard time focusing in the classroom. My head was always outside somewhere else. But when I started working as a journalist, it was probably the best kind of profession for me. And I'm so glad I got this chance to do it, because I get a chance to work on so many different kinds of stories um, at any given time. And so I have to become a bit of an expert in so many different things. So I don't have to work on something so long that I get distracted, you know? But at the same time, every story that I work on becomes the most important story to me at the time. And nothing else really matters when I'm immersed in a story. And one of the reasons why broadcast journalism has been so great for me is because I'm always working with a team. And so no matter where we are or what we're doing, I always have this team that helps me focus back to what we're working on. And when we are in the field, that's all we think about. That's all we talk about. That's all we dream about, is the story that we're working on. And so to that extent, it's been a really great career choice for me.
You briefly mentioned this, but what was it like to be 18 and to be a war correspondent in Iraq and Afghanistan?
I didn't start going to conflict zones until I was in my early 20s. And I think that because I was so young, I underestimated a lot of the risk that I exposed myself to. I mean, when I think back on some of the things that I did in my early 20s, I'm just like, whoa, what was I thinking? Now, as an over 40-year-old, I think that I would take my security precautions a lot more seriously. Not that I didn't take them seriously, but I'd take them a lot more seriously now. After my sister was held captive in North Korea, that really was sort of a kick in the butt for me, because it made me really recognize how real the risk is that journalists undertake. Um, but I wouldn't change anything because I learned so much. For me, getting to travel and see the world and go to places that in my wildest dreams I couldn't even imagine visiting changed me. It made me a, a much, it made me a different person, and it propelled me to really think differently. And I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing or have the life that I have if I didn't start traveling as a young person.
What was your first reaction when you heard that your sister had been captured in Korea?
I got the call from my brother-in-law at about 1 o'clock in the morning, the morning that my sister was abducted on the China side of the North Korea-China border. And because she was going out to cover a story in China and not even supposed to go anywhere near North Korea, I was shocked and initially in a bit of disbelief. But when the reality set in that she had been captured, my heart sunk. Having been there 2 years prior, I really thought that she would be returned to us sooner. But week after week and then month after month would go by, and we would we would just it was just radio silence. And so the 5 months that she was gone was the most harrowing, terrifying experience of my life and my family's lives, because we're all such a close family. And because the US and North Korea don't have a diplomatic relationship, you can't just call the other country and say, can you let her go? Or can we come visit? Or can we talk to her? Um, the reality of two countries without a diplomatic relationship really set in during that experience. We learned a lot from that. Uh, and not a day goes by that we don't express gratitude that my sister was returned to us.
What obstacles did you face when trying to free your sister?
There were tremendous obstacles in trying to get my sister released. Namely, we couldn't just call. We had to communicate through another country. Um, I never thought that my family would be in the midst of a geopolitical um, saga like we were. And it really required a tremendous amount of discipline and diplomacy to negotiate her release. And thank goodness President Clinton agreed to go over and negotiate the release of my sister and her colleague.
How do you stop yourself from getting personally involved with these heartbreaking stories where each one is more heartbreaking than the last?
It's impossible to not get emotionally attached to so many of the people that we feature on our show. Ours is a very um, emotional show. It's a show where people divulge their deepest, darkest secrets, sometimes things that they don't even tell their closest friends or family members. And so I recognize the tremendous responsibility of carrying all of that. And I'm not going to lie, there are times when I will go back to my hotel room and just cry for hours. Um, but I always know that by bringing a lot of these stories to light, we are giving people a chance to know that this stuff is going on. And so that is something that is quite gratifying for me. And I've stayed in touch with a surprising number of people we've featured, because in many ways, we become closer to them than, and in many ways, we become closer to the people we feature than sometimes friends that we see every day, because what they share with us is so deeply personal.
How do you maintain hope and not be overcome with sadness from each of these stories that you cover?
I always maintain hope, even when I'm confronted with the darkest aspects of humanity. I always see light, and usually it comes in the form of people who become aware that sex trafficking is happening, that a disproportionate number of African American men are locked up in US prisons, that so many baby girls have been abandoned in China, for example. When people become enlightened to a lot of these issues, very often they will be or feel compelled to act and to change things. And that's when I recognize the importance of the work that I do. By allowing people to know about a lot of these things that are going on, we very often propel people to go and create change as a result.
How has being a mother changed you as a journalist?
Being a mother has changed me in every way. As a journalist, I would have to say that I strive harder to highlight stories that pertain to women and children, because I recognize how much more of a voice women and children often need. And I hope that I hope that my girls will be proud of the work that I do. For me, um, that's really important. Knowing, or for me, hoping that my girls will be proud of the work that I do is something important to me. Um, and by bringing a lot of these stories to light, by trying to give voice to people who are often voiceless, I hope that they'll one day, watch the work that I do and feel like they want to do something similar.
A female journalist with children versus a male journalist with children?
I always tell young women who are wanting to pursue journalism a couple things. I say, if you're in this to become rich and famous, you're in the wrong line of work because the industry has changed a lot, and um, you just don't see the big kind of news stars that you saw back when Barbara Walters was starting the business or Diane Sawyer. And I always tell women that you have to be willing to make a lot of personal sacrifices, because if you do what I do, you travel a lot and you have to have a really solid infrastructure in place to be able to help you maintain your family. I'm really lucky that I have my mom and my husband's mom who live within a 2 block radius. I have a lovely woman who helps me with the baby. It is a really, really difficult profession for women, which is why I think most of the people I work with are men, because it's hard for men too who have families, but it's just different for women because women, um, I mean, a lot of it is self inflicted, but I think women feel the need to take on so much more responsibility. Even though we may be working full time, we feel it's incumbent upon us to handle every aspect of our families' lives, particularly our kids. I'm sure there are many fathers who would jump at the opportunity to alleviate some of that burden, but I think fundamentally as women, we just feel like we need to do it all ourselves. And when you're working and maintaining a family, it's a lot of juggling. And this idea of balance is something that I find to be completely impossible, frankly. But by the way, but once you recognize that it's impossible, um, then I think that you can work on just making sorry. Once you recognize that balance is impossible, I think that you start to be a little less hard on yourself and a little more forgiving of the mistakes that you may make. Sometimes women kind of get obsessed with the idea of having to figure out how to balance it all, and it's just impossible. And once you recognize that, I think that it becomes a little bit easier because you stop stressing you stop putting that additional pressure on yourself.
Why do you identify yourself as a diehard feminist?
I identify myself as a diehard feminist because for a long time I didn't proudly wear that feminism banner in a way, because I never felt inhibited by my gender as a young person and had gotten a lot of opportunities. I didn't feel like I had to profess that I was a feminist because to me, in my mind, the word feminism conjured up images of women who didn't shave their armpits, who hated men. Um, but my colleague on The View, Joy Behar, kind of scolded me once because she said something along the lines of, you wouldn't even be sitting here if it weren't for feminists like me. And it was at that point that I realized that so many women before me had 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 fought so hard for the opportunities that I had, and that there's still so much more. There's still so much more to do. There's so much more fight that has to be done. And for me, being a diehard feminist is means women should be able to choose whatever they want to do and not feel inhibited in any way by their gender. And as a woman and as the mother of daughters, I will continue to fight for that choice as long as I have to.
Despite the fact that your grandfather was one of the earliest educated Chinese people in America, who got degrees from 2 American universities, he still had the hardest time getting a job.
So, my grandfather came to this country in the late 1940s to live, but he was educated in the US in the 1920s. He went to undergrad at NYU and got his MBA at the University of Colorado. Sorry, but when he emigrated to the US in the late 40s, he could not find a job in his skill set. Even though he had an MBA, I think because he was Chinese, he wasn't getting hired to do anything in the finance industry. And so my grandmother, who was educated at Cambridge in music, ended up carrying her family on her back, essentially. She worked teaching music and saved enough money to help the family open a Chinese restaurant in Folsom, California. It was the first Chinese restaurant in Folsom, California. My grandmother didn't even cook Chinese food up until that moment, but she hired a chef, a cook, and she observed what he was doing, and she eventually became the cook in that restaurant. And so while my grandfather gets a lot of attention in our family because he was so well educated and he came from a scholarly family in China, it was my little 5'2" grandmother who was the real workhorse in my family. And she literally took care of her kids, her grandkids, her brothers and sisters back in the day, and is probably the most formidable person I've ever known. My mom always worked throughout my life, and I think that because she always worked, I didn't even think that I wouldn't work. Like for me, not working was never an option. It was just something that I knew I had to do, that I wanted to do. And I personally can't imagine not working, even though it's hard, especially to do with two young kids. For me, I find being able to work really gratifying and fulfilling, particularly the kind of work that I do. And I hope that what I do and how I do it will impact my kids positively, and that they'll one day be proud of their mom.